Okay, so let's go ahead and start. Welcome to Monday, November 21st, 2022. We are meeting with Dr. Arthur Romano, Associate Professor here at the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. I'm Susan Allen. I'll just be introducing Arthur. Arthur's going to speak on action research in support of community-led peace and social justice education. Arthur is the author of Racial Justice and, what's the title of your book, Arthur?
Racial Justice and Nonviolence Education, Building the Beloved Community One Block at a Time.
Thank you. Thank you. And that book is available from Routledge. And I want to thank you all for joining us. I think Arthur's got some plans for some interaction and some conversation. So anyone who's able to turn on your video, please go ahead and do that. And thank you, Arthur, for making time for this 1 hour conversation. And I'll just acknowledge to everybody that this is being recorded and we're going to include it as part of the methods series on the Carter School website, if anyone wants to watch it later, or it may be available for people in classes that want to watch this in the future. All right, without further ado, Arthur, thank you so much. Over to you.
My pleasure. Thanks. Hey, good to see you all. See some familiar faces, mostly familiar faces, which is awesome. And looking forward to having a chance to chat. So I was planning this to be in a relatively informal type of context. And so I think I'm just going to speak a bit here. And this will provide a good opportunity for me also to kind of reflect on my research prior to and in the process of launching some new work as well. And I'll just pause, I think, at different junctions to strike up discussion or just see if folks have questions or want to kind of dive in. I thought I would start by just talking a little bit about my work and maybe a little bit about my journey. So today I'm going to be focused on action research, especially as it applies to doing educational work, focused on peace and social justice related education. My own educational journey, I think, is relevant here in terms of why I'm interested in those topics. So I come from a first generation family where my mother was born abroad, immigrated when she was young, and my grandparents were farmers, and neither of them had a chance to attend much formal education. So my grandmother was functionally illiterate, never really attended school. My grandfather was educated to about a 4th grade level, and my mother was the first one in our family, that side of the family, to receive a high school diploma. And for myself, I had a somewhat non-linear path, and so I was a student who was in a lot of trouble in high school, and I am of the belief that I think I graduated last in my class in my high school, but I've never seen those records. I've always been interested to know that, but I know that they met with my family because there was concern about my graduation probably 2 or 3 months before graduation. And I went to community college, pretty much straight out of high school. And that was a really transformative experience for me. It was a place in which I started to enjoy education again. I would say I enjoyed education up until about 8th grade. And had some professors and educators who had traveled, which I had never traveled overseas, and I was introduced to poetry from all over the world, and just really came alive in the college setting. And later transferred and went to University of North Carolina, and then worked doing peace building work for about 10 years before I got something called the Rotary World Peace Fellowship, and went and studied at Bradford University, which is probably the place in the world, I would say, that's of higher education peace studies programs that's most similar to our program. It's one of the oldest, and it's maybe the oldest in the world, and in peace studies, and has a similar size community with a mostly international PhD cohort and undergraduate and master program too. Also, I went to Catholic schools as a kid, all through my whole educational experience. And I grew up mostly in a very rural area, primarily white, working class farming community in a county in upstate New York that was highly economically and racially divided. So I would take a bus, public bus, about 45 minutes to school, maybe 45 minutes to an hour to school, and go from my primarily white working class farming community to the local city. And the high school was in the center of the city, right on Main Street, actually. And the inner city, population, the people that lived there were mostly Black, and most people lived below the poverty line. And so I saw this incredible racial segregation. At the same time, the community I was growing up in was going through massive economic upheaval, and the state institutions that had been like a bedrock of the economy there outside of farming were being all downsized, and people were like becoming homeless, and farms were also going out of business. And so this area I was in was also in a steep economic decline. But part of how this is relevant, I think, for my work now is I was in a school. It was a Catholic school. It had a social justice mission, I guess you could say, if you want to really look deeply. If you want to look for it, you could find it there. But there was no discussion at all about what was happening in the city where I was going to school. And there was no sense making it at all about it. And amongst the many reasons that I skipped school a lot, this lack of explanation was part of it, because I was genuinely really intrigued to understand what was going on around me. So I think that that's part of where a deeper racial consciousness and a understanding, a curiosity around racial and economic inequality came to the forefront for me. And it wasn't until many years later, until I went through my own educational journey, really until kind of post September 11th, that I started doing something that might be more like, or right before and then after, more formally, like peace education. And that's because I had been doing peace related work right out of college, doing interfaith work and hosting some conferences and festivals and events that brought people from different faith backgrounds together. But after September 11th, I started getting calls that were like, hey, you're that peace guy, right? Like, well, every brown kid in our building is getting bullied, and can you help us do something? The good thing about that was that I was completely unprepared for that. And so what I could do was learn with the teacher, like by trying to be an ally to the teachers. Many of whom had some of them had really creative ideas. So that was kind of my entree into peace related work. And then also the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I started to do more like direct peace organizing and engagement with street protest. I was involved with a group that walked from the former site of the Pentagon from the former site of the World Trade Towers down to the Pentagon. So we walked about 300 miles, and we hosted events all along the way as we went. And through that, I engaged with like peace-oriented Quaker communities in rural Pennsylvania, and then people who are doing urban peace building work in Baltimore. And so I think from the beginning, I've had a kind of interest in peace education and education that deals with racial inequality and economic inequality. And that interest has been as much about education that takes place outside of the formal walls of a school as it is education that takes place inside of the walls of the school. And for my PhD research, at that point, I had already been working for about 10 years in this area, 8 or 10 years. And I started to think about how to try to understand peace communities and peace education communities that I had worked with, some in the US, some in other places in the world, and became really interested in complexity theory and used complexity theory as my kind of theoretical frame, which influenced my methodology for researching peace education groups. So the idea there was to try to use kind of these concepts from complexity theory to make sense of the ways that peace educators were innovating, the ways that peace educators were networking transnationally and nationally with each other. And the complexity theory frames provided a lot of helpful language that allowed for understanding like dynamic, interconnected, transnational processes, that kind of sociological metaphors being imported from complexity theory to think about research methodology oftentimes involved the use of water as a metaphor. So the notion of like flows, global flows of knowledge and information, the mooring of certain ideas. And so just from a kind of the intersections of theory and methodology, there was a lot in the poetics, sociological poetics of complexity theory that were useful for starting to think about my dissertation. And there wasn't much written at all at that time applying complexity theory to education. So that was bad news. The good news was that there was a lot written or some written at least, in adjacent areas, like especially social movements. So, and I was fortunate that I had a professor who was my supervisor, Graham Chesters, and he's a preeminent scholar on the application of complexity theory to social movements, has written a lot of great stuff. I would suggest that you check out his work when you get a chance. He's since left the academy and is taking photographs in the Arctic to raise awareness about global climate change. And I spend a lot of my time enviously watching his his global travel. But he was able to help me think through how maybe to kind of operationalize some of those concepts and to do analysis, and then to think about how it would influence my methodology. This is like since most of you are PhD students, this is one of those PhD type geeky moments, but I was probably never as happy as when I found out that the American Educational Research Association, the kind of Walmart of educational research, had a little subgroup of people that was studying the application of complexity and education, complexity theory and education. I almost jumped out of my chair in Bradford when I read this, went running to my professors there. I actually found 5 people that are doing this, and William Dahl was his name, an elder professor at Louisiana, one of the universities in Louisiana, had written a book. Later, I discovered Lynn Davies had written a book. I can post those in the chat later. I'll write a note here, applying complexity theory and trying to use it from a methodological point of view, and just also as a kind of I used it more as an analytical tool than anything, as a way of understanding some of what I was seeing in the research I was doing. And I basically kind of did some observation of educators and long-term discussions with ethnographic observation with educators in India and Japan and in the U.S. For my dissertation research at that time. So that might be a first good place to pause. And if anybody here now or on the side is interested in complexity theory, wants to talk about that stuff, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm pretty knowledgeable about some of the strengths and also some of the difficulties of trying to work with a framework like that. And I'm happy to also just take any questions here at this point.
So Arthur, you've got a question in the chat. Kyle has found a Graham Chester's and is asking if he's found the right one.
And I'll ask a question too, because I'm also working with all that stuff, as you know. But so one thing that I've always found a little bit difficult about working with complexity theory is whenever you try and I guess whatever you're trying to tell people in the communities that you're working with, what you're actually doing and what you're applying. And so I guess, especially in the education work, did you find a good kind of pedagogical method for getting some of the key complexity points across? Or would you say that it just influenced you more in terms of your vision as a practitioner and how you would engage with the kind of emergence and trans-contextual nature of stuff, or your just approach to experimentation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah. No, I don't think I told people I was using complexity theory. I think it more helped me formulate questions. So for example, like in complexity theory, there is this concept of the edge of chaos. And the edge of chaos, right, is often used to describe a variety of phenomenon, but one could even talk about it, in relation to, like patterns in which there's a durable structure and then more chaotic elements and how the two are interacting with each other. So for example, what that turned out for me, where that turned out to be useful for me was to look at a kind of central educational dynamic that we all experience, I think, which is the balancing act, the dynamic interaction between set plans and emergent opportunities in education. So the question probably came out around, hey, when have there been times in which something has happened for you and you noticed that there was a kind of something that you saw as an opportunity or a shock that took place or a kind of shift of some kind in which you changed or needed to abandon or your plans. So I don't remember talking openly about the edge of chaos in that way. But that to me became operationalized through that dynamic. But it was actually the other way around from a research point of view, is that I heard people talking often about this balancing act between set plans and emergent opportunities. And then I kind of then reminded me of the edge of chaos ideas. And then conversely, those influenced how I was asking questions and making sense of it while I was in it. Which I think for a talk like this about research methods is important, about how the order of those things.
And you've got a question from Suha.
Hi, Dr. Romano.
Hello.
Hi. Hello.
Hello, I can hear you great.
Yes. First of all, I want to thank you because I am a war survivor from Iraq, and I have a PhD also at a Scar School, and I'm also a disabled person with the cancer status as a result of war in Iraq. So my question, since I am in the level of writing my dissertation, I just want to know if you have something to reflect on using education as a tool to intercept violent circumstances or process in the war zone area. Thanks.
Yeah. Could you tell, yeah, thank you for that. And could you tell me a little bit more about, is there a specific aspect of some kind of educational intervention that you're thinking about?
So I'm actually doing different work. I'm like currently like investigating why people join ISIS, and I'm planning to do a face-to-face interview with the prisoners. And I'm doing like with in the last process with the IRB, so planning to go to Iraq. But in the same time, I was like, when I heard like see this email, I just was like, maybe we can during my travel do some assistance to to my community when I go there for 3 months. That's so I don't have anything like specific in my mind, but like just like reading that you have using like education or pedagogy for like intercept violence, that's like a lot, it means a lot for me at personal level.
Well, thank you. I can offer a couple reflections, and then we could also talk outside of this space as well. I would be happy to do that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. And my educational experience directly in war zones is limited, but I have experience of active conflict, especially in the U.S., and I also did some work in the southern part of Nigeria with former rebel fighters there that were part of an amnesty agreement, in which we did peace education as part of a kind of reentry program. But a couple of different things come to mind. One is that, especially since you mentioned this component about ISIS and this, is that sometimes, so for folks who have experienced violence and who have grievance and who could have rage over the nature of that injustice, sometimes the nonviolence education, which focuses on an active resistance to injustice and can even use the direct like language of militancy, can be useful and can sometimes make some inroads that conflict resolution type more focused programs might not. Mm-hmm. So in other words, the question is not, in some cases, is this wrong and should we fight? What are the weapons we should use and what does it mean to win?
Yes.
And so that just may be like that's just one path that comes to mind. Okay. Around. So I think that's in terms of, like more like engaging directly with people who've already been mobilized and who have a kind of notion of a militant identity. And then as far as the other components, then everything, for the whole world of peace education is open, which, which could include many, many different aspects. And I would be happy to share resources in terms of, there's components. So there's gendered components of peace education programmatic work around gender. There's programmatic work around environmental components. There are many ways that you can go at that based on people's needs. But what I'll say that connects back to this research methodology conversation is that I'm of the belief that we sometimes have an elitist interpretation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that we tend to think that people whose primary needs are disrupted by cycles of poverty and violence are not in the business of doing the self-actualization and high-level meaning-making work. And I think that people who experience violence oftentimes are very concerned with why this is happening and what it takes to change that.
That's right.
And so from an action research point of view, then it's about providing peace education is about providing also opportunities for people to be supported in asking questions about why this is happening and what is it going to take to change this. That's right. Rather than like bringing a program in that like has the answers. With that said, peace education programs where they're just totally have no shape and form, and are just asking people what they think the problems of the world are and how to solve them, may not also offer enough kind of support and structure for people to be able to take action and conceptualize the problems and all of that, because people's lives are busy and because they're dealing with a lot of other stuff also. So yeah, so I think there's a balance there between having people drive the process of meaning making, and having a process where people see themselves. I think that's part of it, is they see themselves as important knowledge producers. Like they are experts already. Like the people you would work with already are experts in like surviving and responding and dealing with violence, right? This would be true for, I would imagine, many people that you know.
Yeah, that's true. But I feel like from my living experience under like Saddam War and then the Gulf War, then the US War, that we still lacking in defining the terms of violence, and still lacking in defining the concept of nonviolent action. So we have this, like we survive as a part of our nature as a human, but we lack the knowledge how we shape them. For example, I know how to survive, like I have my inner instinct, like how to go from this street to this street to survive the violence, or how to know how to make a peace in, like resolve a conflict like between two tribes. But this is like as a part of nature, but not a part of knowledge. So that's like we have experience, but we don't have knowledge, and there. That's why I'm looking forward to like maybe we can develop something to like be more like knowledgeable about for all, like because people have limited access to these terms in war zone in general, in Iraq, Syria, Yemen. That's where I like have my experience in this area. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I think also too, what you say makes me think also of the fact that there's so many aspects of violence that become like normalized.
That's right. Yeah.
So we don't see them anymore.
Yeah.
So there are all kinds of activities in peace education around and conflict resolution around, showing different kinds of actions, and are these violence, are these not violence, like that.
Yeah.
So if that part that you talked about, we have some good research, and this comes out of, in the book, the group I was using as a case study, the Connecticut Center for Nonviolence, their curriculum, which is teaching about Martin Luther King's thinking and these principles of nonviolence. There's the evaluations have shown consistently that students' ideas about violence become more complex and more nuanced as a result of attending and participating in those workshops. Of course, the next question is then how do you support people in doing something about that, right?
Yes, that's right.
Also, right. But it makes sense what you're saying. This conceptualization part is really important too. I've got another little bit I could share, and then take a pause. So I wanted to talk about, let me say maybe, I have an assumption about what the discussions have been like. That's probably not true, but let me just say, in action research, oftentimes we talk about having a plan in advance that you work with a community around. Like we develop an action research project together. And I should be forthright that the majority of my research has not been like that. It's been mostly that I am engaged in action with groups, mostly as a kind of educational consultant or kind of ally, thought partner, and participant. And then at some point along in the process, I then start kind of engage in exploring the possibilities of writing about that process, and examining that process, more broadly. So, for example, in the Truth Telling Project, which was a project that brought together family members who had lost loved ones to police violence. I was a founding, we would say now in retrospect, a founding advisor, but there was no project in the beginning. So I met Dr. Dave Ragland, who was one of the founders, along with founding directors, along with Corey Bush, who is now serving in Congress. And Congresswoman Bush was doing frontlines work, attending to people's physical and medical needs at the protest, and then switched over and participated in the protest. Dr. Ragland had grown up in North St. Louis and was home for a family member's birthday, I believe, when Michael Brown, the unarmed teenager, was shot in Ferguson, started to participate in the protests. And we met there. And during that kind of process, Dr. Ragland was looking at the possibilities for truth and reconciliation in response to what was happening in Ferguson. Of course, like the truth and reconciliation processes often take place in a post-conflict moment, and Ferguson was not a post-conflict moment, right? But that's how I had met him. That's how I met him and got involved in that work. And it was only, later and over time, firstly, our writing mostly was initially around getting, kind of supporting the projects. So some of that was like for popular, or for media publication type contexts. Others were for documents for the organization. We also at the school developed a toolkit because communities in other parts of the country wanted to have their own truth-telling events. And later, we wrote a book chapter that kind of chronicled the process at that phase of the process. It was in Dan Rothbard's edited volume on systemic humiliation. I don't recall the whole full title of the book title, and there we wrote about the project. So in other words, I didn't enter. I'm a professor, and so I'm interested and curious about these processes, but it wasn't the kind of thing where I said, like, wait, in the beginning, just hold on a second. I would like for this to be a formal research project, and I'm going to go now write an IRB and kind of would love to talk with you all about the scope of that research. It moved much more quickly than that, and I had no idea where that work was going. And we certainly had no idea, at least I didn't, that it would grow in the ways that it has grown, and that had a lot to do with the nature of the moment in which that work took place. Similarly, with the Connecticut Center for Nonviolence work, which is the subject of my book, I started working with the center from the early days when it was founded, or when they were exploring those ideas in Hartford and in and around Connecticut. And it was nearly a decade later before I felt like I was in a position to and wanted to write about the work that was taking place there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, this moment where that transition takes place. And I think this is not really in the book, but so this will give me a chance to talk it through a little bit more. I think that shift. So firstly, I'm not collaboratively writing with my participants. We don't co-write. The book is not co-written. So I shared chapters, I got feedback, questions that are animating the book. I went back and forth with the educators many times. Sometimes it's hard for me to remember what they said and what I said and what was my thought and their thought, because we've been working together for a long time. And so I'd go back to try to clarify. But there becomes this magical point. It's not magical. There becomes this distinctive point in which I say, hey, I'm doing something called an IRB. And it's a formal research a request to do research in which it's going to be reviewed by an ethics committee. Here's how I'm thinking about formulating the project. Here's how I'm writing it up. Here are some of the questions that I'm exploring. And it was interesting because I was mostly in that point working with the director, and we have built, I would say, we have a good deal of trust, and that person is a friend of mine, I would say, at this point in life, without reservation. But there was definitely like a, whoa, you're going to be doing what? Like, so how are we involved in this? How do we know what's said? Who's going to get credit for what? How do we assure that you're not going to write stuff that we wouldn't, sign on to? And that process continued, at each junction. So then there was a component which we needed to send letters out, right, for people to be to sign. Well, for minors, we had to get permission of parents to participate in the interviews, and letters sent out to community members that would be interviewed, and so there we needed to have a bunch of discussions about how the language of the letter would land for community members, about when or if or how community members' literacy rates or opportunities to do reading like this, or whether a letter could be sent and that would be the best way to do so, or whether there needed to be some kind of like direct face-to-face handing off of the material. And so I think many questions, all of which were really thick with power dynamics, kind of came to the surface at that point. And because I was already working with the group, and in some ways I'm working with the group in ways in which they call on me because to participate. So that's really different than what's happening in the situation I'm explaining. Calling me up and saying, hey, listen, we're doing a training of trainers, and it would be great to have somebody there who could kind of observe and give feedback to these new trainers, and even give feedback to the people who are giving feedback to those trainers. Can you come up here and help us? Is really different and support us in that than this piece of, now you're writing a book, and you're going to be deciding what is said, and you're going to be taking this and offering it into an environment in which we don't have a ton of trust around that environment, and it's not clear what we necessarily get from that. So that resulted in many, many conversations. And the structure of the book also is such in which I write a vignette at the start of each chapter that describes one of the peace educators. And it's relatively short, I mean, considering the complexity of this person's life. It's like, I don't know, I have the book here, I would say 5 pages maybe. And so here are people that really well, and the incredible sense of responsibility I felt, and the challenges of trying to shine a light on on who they are and the nature of their work, without reinforcing racial stereotypes and tropes and ideas that we have about urban violence, and that they would feel comfortable with, when I showed it to them, that they would feel was accurate. When I showed it to them was probably one of the most difficult places, and I think that's a place where I could reflect more into. This is one of these junctions of a change, right? It's one thing if you and I have a relationship and there's a sense of integrity or maybe solidarity in the work. It's quite different if I'm going to share to the world your story or a piece of your story. So I think all of those junctions in some ways are all the same power dynamics are there, whether you name it as a research project in the beginning or whether you're doing it this way. But in this process in which I'm talking about it, it's a change of role, and your insider status is disrupted, or is that perturbed or altered in this process of the announcement, right? Of like, because then there are even few people who are like, oh, you are a professor? Like there are definitely a couple people like, oh, for real? Like you're okay. Like I had some vague sense like you're a teacher or something, like so, and other people knew, so yeah, I think I'll open it up for questions, because actually your questions will be helpful for me, and I'm sure you're gonna have really challenging ones that I'll be able to think about out loud, and then probably get better in my thoughts around them over time.
Should we go to Ashton?
Thanks. And I guess one thing is I appreciate you giving us the introduction that you did. It was just really nice to have that context around how you came to be in this world of education yourself. And let's definitely talk about that 300-mile walk at some point. I'd love to hear more about it. I'm always curious to hear what the reflection process is like with folks as they go through these things, and if you had a very deliberate process that you kind of did as you were working either on the book or as the project was starting to kind of emerge as a project. And then also I'm curious to what extent you when you entered into this relationship with them in the very beginning and didn't have a sense that this would evolve into some sort of academic research initially, did you still take, this is more of a tactical question, but did you still like take notes and try to think about it as an academic, or did you let yourself just be the practitioner and not really think about it from that perspective, and then have to reflect back and remember all of the things that happened and what you might have been thinking about at that time, and how did you deal with that process?
All really good questions. Yeah. So I wasn't taking like meticulous notes over the whole 10-year time period, which in some ways might have been helpful. It was a manageable amount of stuff to kind of go through, but it provided some helpful context. But definitely in the lead up to and during the research process, which was well over a year and included that one summer, I basically like spent the majority of the summer up in one of the neighborhoods in Hartford. I took notes, and mostly something I learned from my dissertation, which I didn't do enough of as a PhD student. And this is really, I think, something people probably told me this, but I don't know if it really landed, is like sometimes also the things that you don't do are some of the most important things that come out of your dissertation. So taking, like I use audio dictation, and just that allows me to get some stuff down when I'm so exhausted or I wouldn't have time or anything like that. And so I would, do that. Like I just leave a meeting and get in the car, and before I drive, take my phone out and look around me and describe what I see in my immediate context, and describe any reflections and thoughts, and paint the picture of the place where I am in. So literally like physical space, parties that were there, how warm was it, how cold was it, what was the, and then talking about the dynamics that just took place, the questions I'm leaving with, and surprises and those kinds of things. And that could be like 2 minutes of audio dictation. And it's good then to kind of also check in too, because even on your like observations of what's happening, if you listen back over time, you might see, I focused a lot on, I don't want to say something really silly, but like the weather or something, and I wish I knew what the actual cross streets were there, like of where that was, that night. So yeah, I think that I was taking notes mostly during the formal research time and in the lead up to it. I had a lot of information because there were many documents generated through the years. And so I had previous drafts of ideas that we discussed that went then into like grant proposals or pieces of like every once in a blue moon, like a press release or something that I contributed to, or pieces like that. And then different kinds of documents the center had generated that reminded me of certain time periods through the years as well. Does that answer your question? I felt like there was a third component to it. Oh,
I think her
she
internet's
went
going
into
in
the
and
tunnel.
out. She's on the train.
yeah.
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 I think tunnel's a probably good guess there. Yeah. While we wait for her to come back out of that tunnel, Arthur, I had a question about, would you consider writing about this process more? Because your book doesn't go deep in depth on that. And I think this would be useful. And as I was listening to you, I was realizing I haven't written about my process either. And so maybe we should think about this might be a chance to work together again on another article.
Yeah.
Compare and contrast and integrate and look at kind of these questions that Ashton was asking of, being practitioners and also having these moments of, oh, this is something that would be useful to share with the community in a different way, and how could we do it in a respectful, ethical way?
Yeah, I would like that, and it'd be interesting to think of how much we can do that ourselves if we brought in a third party or something, one of the PhD students, or let's think about that. Thank you for that invite. How many students here are thinking about doing participatory action research? Audrey is. Marianne is too. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing too that comes up is often when I'm involved in doing supervision of students that are doing participatory action research, and Susan and I often work together on those dissertations, as I'm kind of the voice for like, what do you want? So, you're doing this research, you're interested in the community's thoughts and their knowledge, and then like, what do you want? What do you need? And what are you going to do with this? And there are sometimes really interesting, cool moments in the research process where that comes out in my experience. So I can think of experiences at the Connecticut Center for Nonviolence, for example, where, like Pastor Lane will be like, I'll be facilitating, asking all these questions. And it's like, well, Doc, you've studied this stuff, so why don't you share, what your research is and what do you think about this, right? Like, so there's also an ethical weight in the desire to be an ally to supporting knowledge production in community settings. There's also an ethical weight to holding back on your own contributions and your own clarity around your own commitments. That's one part of it. And the other side is that when it comes to writing, which all of you will write a dissertation that will be authored by you, and in this case, I wrote a book, it was authored by me and not co-written. I think that's part of this transition that is like, okay, well, you're going to get something out of this, right? So we had so that became a real conversation around, there was a number of conversations around, well, what does this mean for the center? What does it mean for the individuals involved? Like, how do we make this, is there a way in which this is working for both parties? Is this just purely something that like is mostly about my own professional journey and sharing it with other communities? And the benefits are clear for me because I'm a professor, and so there's rewards for doing this. And then others might read something and do something with it, and it comes, back to and maybe the direct, results for the center are not so clear and all of that. We worked around that quite a bit. I think choosing to structure the book around the principles of nonviolence, which are key aspects they teach around, made it so that the book had a more clear contribution for them as a teaching tool as well. There was this other book, and this is the thing that slowed the project down so much, and this has implications for research methodology. There was this interesting book around the challenges of navigating the structures of urban violence prevention funding and the non-for-profit industrial complex and the general disinterest in funding and supporting urban youth violence prevention, and how the folks here were navigating those structural impediments in ways that were really creative and sometimes in ways that might be problematic. And so that was like a sociological book. That one was going to be like that was going to be really interesting to academics. And maybe even practitioners, but harder to see that. And so it took me forever to figure out the structure for this. Here's one of the really interesting, frustrating things about this is less about research method and more about writing, but about structure is it's one of the hardest components to figure out. And you have very complex thinking about the structure, but in the end, the structure is always kind of simple. And in this book, it's like this: vignette, principle of nonviolence, and philosophical insights and literature insights on the principle itself, and then classroom snapshots and the thinking of the educators working in the field. And the fourth part is like tips and takeaways. And every chapter repeated that structure. But that structure is connected to the research methodology. You see what I'm saying? Because there's questions about who benefits and who has ownership and as a result of how it's written and all of that. And that was something I tried to be really committed to. And it was also part when I talked to the academic publishers, I think they wanted the price of the book to be $75. And I was like I cannot have a book there's no chance, that's just ridiculous for me to ask community members to buy. Like that's you could erase my, which turned out to be a good, I don't know if this is going to be online, but good negotiating trick is, I said, just, you can take away my royalties, which, like academics don't make royalties generally, but I would have done it if I made, but take away the royalties. And because it has to be affordable, like that's the thing that matters most to me. So I think our writing structure also has something to do with our methodology too, right? But I guess the question for you folks is like who are doing participatory action research or action research is, which you've already been thinking about very deeply, and I've talked to many of you, is about this, like, well, what's the give back from this piece I'm writing? And sometimes with a dissertation, it's not going to be it may not be so obvious or immediate. And it might also be that you're able to speak to other audiences about this and give people insight into a world that they can support or know about, and that it's not always like it may not always be a direct, like immediate benefit to the community. And that's very thorny ethical territory, I think.
So Arthur, we have about 5 minutes left, and I wonder.
Is that possible?
Yeah, there's such a rich discussion. So I wonder if you were to think of kind of one key message that you want to leave us all with, your insights on, the research process that you have gone through, maybe any takeaway that you want to kind of focus on for the last moments.
I have a couple that are maybe a bit bland. One is, I think, it's just so important to understand the context that we're researching in, and anything you can do to invest in understanding that context is is energy well spent. And so if you think you can have an extra month of research, then do it. You know, just whatever you're bound, what's possible, push that to its whatever its edges are, you know, within the confines of your life funding, et cetera. So that's one. The other is that, you know, relationships are very important to research, and interviews are snapshots of a singular moment in time. And so whenever you have an opportunity to pull other data, either through repetitive interviews or other ways of getting snapshots from other time periods, that's helpful. If you can't do that in a dissertation, that's also okay. Oftentimes because you set yourself up to be able to do that research in the future, where you can search out your own funding and do that work. So not everything has to be done in the dissertation. But I think for me, the biggest driver is that you know, we as human beings, we are meaning makers. And so you will never be exclusively in that role. Like, that's not possible, and nor is it desirable. And so if you find yourself in a hardened position where you've been like backed into the expert corner, allow your curiosity to build the bridge back to connection around the fact that you are both interested in making meaning around this topic. On the other hand, if you're so interested in being an ally and hearing about them that you've become completely opaque and there's no you anymore for them to grab onto or see, you're probably not also getting the most knowledge out of the situation, because there needs to be like a conversation is an interaction, and that interaction includes them knowing you as a meaning-making being too. And so I don't know where that place is for you, but that that continual renegotiation, if you're doing action or participatory action research, although this would come into any area of research, I think to some extent, that negotiation, renegotiation, reflection are key. And that's the last thing. When you do your notes, your audio, you know, your video notes, I think you can flag these up. You know, it's place and time and interview, who is there, and all that stuff is important in your notes and the painting the picture. But so is too this place around this, you know, questions around what is the nature of how I am in these questions with people? What are the obstacles to us being able to make meaning around this together? What do I need to do to maybe open these doors up further? What's something I wish I knew that we're not talking about? What might be something they wish they knew about me or wish that I was talking about? And those are iterative, repetitive questions that you can come back to, just to kind of open the jar lid up a little bit and allow some breathing room when you start to get into like a regular rhythm of doing the research.
Well, thank you, Arthur. You've given us so much to think about. And I know I'm going to be going over these notes and reflecting a lot. I've liked your particularly, you know, the idea of balancing, like on the one hand, you know, wanting to be really elicitive and respectful of the people you're engaged with, and on the other hand, not wanting to be an opaque, only taking knowledge, but bring what you've got and bring your own insights and share, and really being a true partner and finding the balance there that's respectful and constructive and useful for everyone. So yeah, lots to think about. Thank you so much. And I look forward to this. I hope that this conversation will spark many, many more in the future.
Likewise. Thank you all.
Nice to see everyone. Thanks.